Welcome to the Possibility Action Network podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Middleton, aka Possibility Man. We're committed to bringing you guests who strive to better people's lives and serve as a force for good in the world. Our guest today is Dr. Anna Yusim. She is an internationally known psychiatrist and executive coach. She helps influential individuals achieve greater impact, purpose, and joy in their lives and work. Her clients include Forbes 500 CEOs, Olympic athletes, A-list entertainers, and the chairs of academic departments at top-tier universities. Dr. Yusim is also a clinical assistant professor at Yale Medical School. She's creating a mental health and spirituality center to foster a stronger connection between Yale Medical School and Yale Divinity School. She's the author of the book Fulfilled: How the Science of Spirituality Can Help You Live a Happier, More Meaningful Life. She's also written hundreds of articles on psychiatry and mental health. Dr. Yusim frequently appears on U.S. television networks like CNN, ABC, and NBC, as well as international TV and radio shows and global podcasts. Dr. Yusim, welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
And look, I wanted people to know how smart and famous you are, so I wanted to read that bio about you. But of course, you're also a very down-to-earth, accessible person as well. And they'll discover this in our conversation. I want to make this announcement, Dr. Yusim, to our listeners and our followers to follow, like, and share this podcast wherever you find it. Your support matters. I know that you hear this all the time, but follow, subscribe, and share this podcast. It is appreciated. Dr. Yusim, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Stephen. I am here in Connecticut in my home, and I split my time between Connecticut and New York. So when I'm back here, it's always a beautiful, very restful time. And today we have a little bit of a foggy day, but it's very beautiful out. And so life is good. How are you?
But things are going well. I'm in South Carolina. We had a touch of Hurricane Debbie, but we didn't get much where I am, just a little bit of rain. But look, I'm ready for you. So I want to jump right into it if you're ready.
Let's do it.
Why did you study medicine?
Yeah, it's a good question. I originally was going to study mathematics. I come from a long line of mathematicians. I have uncles, cousins, everybody was mathematical in my family. My dad, a biomedical engineer, retired. My mother, a computer programmer, retired, very math focused. And what I had so much passion for in high school and also in college was actually math. I was a big nerd. I would be a member of the math team and I would spend hours doing these contest problems, and it would give me great joy to do this. There was something so beautiful about the symmetry of numbers that I just loved. And I went to Stanford and became part of the math team, started doing, what I did way back in high school. But many of the TAs, unfortunately, came from other countries and didn't speak very good English, and I couldn't understand a lot of what was being said. And somehow, in the light of that, my passion for math starts to dwindle. And half of my class, probably over half my class, were pre-meds. So I'm like, maybe they know something, because I, wasn't going to be a mathematician anymore. And so I jumped on the pre-med bandwagon, ended up also really loving it, and especially falling in love with psychiatry. And that's how I ended up in medical school.
Mm-hmm. So, there's so many specialties to choose from in medicine. I'm not going to name them, but you gravitated to psychiatry. Why was that? What hit you? What sparked this thing?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. So at Stanford, I studied biology and philosophy, and psychiatry is a way of philosophizing the mind. It's actually the closest to math when you think about it that you can get, because you're trying to understand a human being in a very logical, rational way and trying to go very deep within the psyche. So towards the end of my college education, I came across the books of this professor at Stanford, Irvin Yalom. The book was called Lying on the Couch. And he's an existential psychiatrist, meaning that he ascribes any struggle that we as human beings have to the struggles of existence themselves, which he defines in four categories: our quest for purpose and meaning in our life, our struggle with our aloneness, fear of death, and so let's see, freedom, purpose, fear of death, and there's one more, which will come to me. So anyways, there's like four main ones. And I read his books and I was just so captivated and thought that this is what I want to do. I loved how he conceived of human nature, how he thought about human minds and human beings. And I'm like, I want to be like this person. I want to see patients, help them understand themselves, and then write about them in books. So that's how psychiatry came to be.
Right. Do you have a sense that you being drawn to psychiatry was a calling? Was it something spiritual, even then, back then, when you made the choice?
I think so. I think in retrospect, this was so the right profession for me. It's so much more the right profession, much more so than mathematics would have been. And I want to just backtrack. The four existential struggles are quest for purpose and meaning, the freedom to do with our life that which we want, our struggle with aloneness in this world, because even if we're with others, we're all ultimately alone, and fear of death. So those are the four existential struggles. And yeah, it really, you're exactly right, Dr. Stephen. It really does feel like a soul calling. And I'm so happy I chose this profession because it's been so consistently gratifying with so many layers of nuance of what you can do and directions you could take it. So absolutely.
Yeah, I'm glad you're doing it as well. But I just want to roll back a moment because you said that you come from a family of scientists, of bioengineers and other fields. Did you get any strange looks that you were moving into psychiatry as opposed to mathematics or one of the hard sciences?
Oh my God, no, you're a doctor, great. No, it was when I wanted to
Uh-huh.
take some time off beforehand to backpack through Europe to work as a
Uh-huh.
management consultant. That's when they were like, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Once I finally
Yeah.
had, was in medical school, had an MD, it didn't matter. That was,
Yeah.
my parents
Yeah.
were happy that I was going to have a secure profession.
Yeah, yeah. But some scientists, let me say this. It seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, that science and spirituality are considered to be strange bedfellows, at least at some point, in our time. And wasn't it the French philosopher Rene Descartes who said that the universe is mainly mechanical, that he kind of dismissed this? So uh, do you find that people look at it as saying, spirituality is woo-woo. It's something that, a lot of people don't embrace. How do you feel about that? What do you sense of that?
Absolutely. And this is so why I've been drawn to this intersection of science and spirituality, because the
Hmm.
science of spirituality is very much a paradox. And the two
Hmm.
are strange bedfellows, Dr. Stephen. And so, the methods through which science comes into being is double-blind placebo-controlled trials, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that which you can see with your eyes, quantify, measure, repeat is real, and that which isn't is not. And this is
Hmm.
in contrast to spirituality, because the things that are real with spirituality are things that are deeply personal, subjective, transcendent, very difficult to quantify, very difficult to subject to double-blinded, placebo-controlled trials. So this is
Yeah.
why these two things are often not used in the same sentence, but also why it's so important to put them together. And I think the
Hmm.
world is opening up more so than ever now to understanding where science and spirit coalesce and come together.
Yeah. And for laymen like me, sometimes when I look at x-rays, I'm thinking that a doctor, an MD, should know more than anyone else that the body is not who you are, because you don't see a person inside there. You see, it's almost empty space. Would you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's very interesting, right? Like
Yeah.
what is real and what's not. The idea in
Yeah.
quantum physics of what's real is very different from the idea of what's real as far as what we see with our eyes and what we're able
Yeah.
to conceive of in this three-dimensional world using our mind and our brain as a filter.
And I wanted to talk to you when I discovered you because when I discovered you, when I learned about you, because you got this medical background. You are a medical doctor on the one hand, but you're well steeped in spirituality on the other hand. And if there's anyone who could help us bridge this gap, it's someone like you. So let me ask you, what's what was your path to, let's call it, spiritual awakening? And I hope that you don't mind me using that phrase and applying it to you. But what got you there? What put you in the path to seeking a kind of your awakening?
Yeah, if you told me 25 years ago that I was going to be a spiritual person, I would have laughed. Spirituality at that time was furthest from my mind. My mother was actually quite spiritual. And so my family is Jewish. We were born in Russia. I came over to America when I was 5, and my mother was always a spiritual seeker, always reading books about other spiritual traditions outside of Judaism. My father was much more rational and practical. So for him, he also very much valued our Jewish identity, but for him, it was more about history and culture. The people who were persecuted by virtue of being Jews, how we had come from them, the creation of Israel, things like that. So, yeah, so I came into this world a lot more like my father. I was not a spiritual person at all. It just wasn't my inclination. It was very rational, scientific, and was that way up until the end of my residency training. But then strange and unusual things started to happen to me towards the end of my residency training that I couldn't ignore. And I started to beg the question, these things that I'm experiencing aren't fitting very well into the model of the mind that I'd learned previously. Could there be another model to explain this even better? And I'll give you an example of some of those experiences. I remember like in residency, sitting in an ice cream store, and a psychic with her child comes in and says to me, I have a message for you. Can I give you a message? She looks rather innocuous. And I said, sure, tell me your message. So the psychic proceeds to tell me all of these truths about my life that she cannot possibly know, that weren't even written in my journal, certainly weren't on Facebook or that you couldn't Google. And she just knew all these things. And I was just, including the name of the guy who I had a crush on at the time. She's kind of like pulled that out of midair. And so I just was completely dumbfounded. I'm like, how can this happen? How could this person have that, access or insight into my mind and into my life? And so it just led me to go down this, road of inquiry to understand our interconnectedness as human beings, our capacity to, have empathy for each other, and how that empathy can sometimes even bleed into telepathy and being able to read each other, and the way in which basically human beings are more connected and can even develop that capacity of connectedness if we desire.
Mm-hmm. I love it. So how did you tell us about how you immersed yourself into the area of spirituality? What did you do? What kinds of practices did you follow? What kinds of readings or even teachers?
Yeah. So right around the time that this came into my life, I had a dream, and the dream had the words Kabbalah revealed on it. My mother had
Oh,
sent me books about Kabbalah. So Kabbalah is a form of mysticism. There's Christian Kabbalah, there's Jewish Kabbalah. So it's a form of mysticism. My mom had sent me books before, and I looked on my bookshelf. Was this, sign from my dream just a book on my bookshelf that I needed to read or reread? And I didn't have a book like that. And so I just remember the dream. And a few weeks later, I'm walking to meet a friend for dinner, and I see the exact sign from my dream, Kabbalah revealed. It was the New York Kabbalah Center. And so I went in and signed up for a class, and Kabbalah ended up being a really interesting and important way for me to understand spirituality in the beginning of my spiritual awakening. So I started going to classes, learning about the very auspicious, powerful windows in time that we have and the meaning energetically behind them. So it was really fascinating. And it was so different than anything I'd ever learned spiritually, scientifically. It was like a whole new model of the mind and model of the world that started to answer the questions that I started to have from these interesting experiences from before.
hmm. So how can the Kabbalah help just an ordinary person lead a healthier, happy life?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And so there was a lot of teachings, and there's a lot of what they call spiritual technologies, like certain things that you can do to elevate your frequency. And some of the practices or the teachings were very psychological in nature. One of them was actually to go against your nature, to do that which is
Mm.
most difficult for you to do, no matter what it is, right? Because we as human beings have a choice. And for every decision, for every day, we have a choice as to whether to choose growth and transformation or comfort and complacency. Comfort and complacency is the easy path. And oftentimes we want to take that. Oftentimes we will take that path because nobody can be pushing themselves all the time. But ultimately, as far as how we live, we want to choose the path of growth and transformation. And so that means often going against your nature, doing that which is difficult for you as opposed to easy. For instance, if you have some anxiety, social anxiety, and you might avoid group settings. And here you have this invitation to this group that actually can be very uplifting and transformative. Going against your nature would mean to actually go and do what's hard for you. And that's
Yeah.
how we grow as human beings. We do that which is hard, and we identify that and go against our nature and do it again and again and again. So that's one of the teachings,
Uh-huh.
but there are so many more.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's real good. It reminds me of a neuropsychiatrist who lived before 1950. His name was Abraham Lowe, and he said, "Do what you fear to do." You know, and I think that's part of what you're saying there. But you also studied Eastern spirituality. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of the Buddhist practices and the fundamental assumption that life is suffering and that the way to release suffering is by relinquishment of desire and non-desire. Those are such powerful concepts, and they go so much against what we are taught, in the Western world. And, I think that that concept is actually very interesting paired together with Kabbalah, because in Kabbalah, the idea of desire is actually the beginning of everything. Everything begins with your desire. You're not taught to negate your desire, to relinquish your desire, to transform your desire. You're actually taught to harness your desire and to get an even bigger desire, a desire that's more elevated in line with your higher self. So to really, really dream big and then figure out what aspects of yourself you need to transform to become at a vibration equivalent to that which you desire. And this is in contrast to Buddhism, which is about desire is something that you actually want to work against and you want you know, to relinquish. So
Mhm.
two practices with a completely different central focus, opposite central focuses, actually.
Mhm. So in preparing for this conversation with you, and if I got this wrong, let me know, but I think I got it right that you spent some time in India and also lived in an ashram for a time. Did I get that right?
You did. And it's actually so funny. So I was in the ashram of Amma, the hugging guru. She comes and hugs everybody, and people get in long lines and actually can wait days to get a hug from Amma. And she was declared a saint, one of the few living saints. She's this amazing Indian woman. She has devotees from all over the world who've given her many, many millions of dollars. And so she uses this for charitable contributions to nations who have undergone national disasters, et cetera, all over the world. So she's just amazing humanitarian. And the funny thing that you mentioned her is that she was actually in New York City and is in New York City for the last 3 days. Today is her last day. And I got a hug from her again for the first time since the pandemic because she hasn't visited New York City. She would come once a year before that. But I just got a hug from her on Monday. And it was
Hmm.
amazing to be in her ashram. This is 20 years ago when I was a medical student, because I'd actually meant to go to the ashram as a time for peace, renewal, rejuvenation. And it was after a 2 week trip throughout India where I stayed with the families of my dear friends, and then presented at a conference in Delhi. And then I had this time at an ashram. So I went to this ashram thinking I was going to relax, and it turns out it's her birthday. So her devotees flock in from all over the world, and there's not 1 inch of space. So rather than this relaxing, peaceful time, it's like a nonstop week-long party. And so I just surrendered to it, had a great time, and learned a ton. It was very powerful.
Wow, that's interesting. 20 years ago, and wow, another connection. That's awesome.
Exactly.
I guess when the universe arranges it, you know, it's going to happen.
Going to
So,
happen.
what are some of the things that you learned from your time with this teacher and being in the ashram with also other spiritual seekers? What did you walk away with?
Yeah, I learned that there are a few principles that actually transcend all religious traditions and that
Mhm.
there are certain principles and spiritual traditions, and there's certain principles that are very specific and individual. And some of the unifying principles are about the power of love. Every
Mm.
single religion in its own way and spiritual practice wants us to align more with love and less with fear. And, whatever is the opposite of fear, whether it be faith, love, joy, courage, that's what we want to align with. And fear and other emotions, which in Kabbalah they're defined as the offshoots of ego. And that could include fear, anger, hatred, control, judgment, all of those things, which are all normal parts of the human experience. We've all felt them. We've certainly know many people who feel them on a regular basis. So it's not how can you not feel them? It's how can you be aware of those feelings and then transform and transmute it into something that is going to enable you to achieve what you want to achieve. Sometimes anger is important to move things forward.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes we can't help but hate because atrocities have been committed. Those are very human things. And so, what do you do to transform that so that we can actually love ourselves, love each other, and elevate the consciousness of our common humanity?
Mhm. Why do you suppose it's, and I'm assuming that it's difficult for some people. I mean, just look at, conflicts everywhere, conflicts in families. Why do you suppose that in some cases I'm kind of hedging a bit because I can't make a statement that people just don't love one another, but it seems challenging for some of us to really love one another, that agape love that we want to see in the world. Why do you suppose it's challenging for some of us?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question, Dr. Stephen, because the question I think about a lot, especially with the polarization and divisiveness that's present in our country and in our world right now. And I think that there are many reasons. And I think the reasons are biological, psychological, social, and spiritual. So it's not just an easy answer. I think it's actually very, very multifaceted. And so let's actually break it down. Let's go like to all of those things. I think first of all, um, people are very scared and uncertain, and we've undergone great uncertainty in a way we never have known before. And when there's fear and uncertainty, rather than looking within and often trying to have a really nuanced perspective on it, it's very easy to scapegoat, to point fingers, to have greater polarization, to say that they're right, I'm wrong, and they're bad, I'm good. And that ultimately drives people's ideologies. But what happens when you have that kind of black and white divisive stand is our culture and all of our social media and the advertisements on Google, et cetera, are, are such that you're going to have an echo chamber of your most divisive beliefs. So rather than
Mhm.
giving you a more nuanced perspective, maybe, Dr. Stephen, you should think about this perspective. And maybe
Mhm.
you shouldn't be so black and white. Maybe there's shades of gray that you should consider. Rather than social media giving you that, it'll give you more things that are more about fear mongering. And here's an even more divisive and even more extreme perspective that you haven't considered. And so these echo chambers create even greater polarization. So that's at the social level. And that's just a little tiny bit. There's
Mhm.
also tribalism, there's identity politics, there's so many different things, right? So that's the social level. At the
Yeah.
biological level, there's a lot of people who are not where they need to be biologically for so many different reasons. It's because
Mhm.
we are exhausted, we have the wrong diets, our food supply is not what it used to be. There's so many contaminants in our food. There's a lot of electromagnetic radiation that has effects that we don't even fully understand. There's all kinds of things biologically that are affecting human beings, right? And
Mhm.
many of us, unfortunately, don't make choices that are the best choices. We don't choose to eat the right foods. We don't exercise enough.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
so biologically, people are affected as well.
Mhm.
Psychologically, this is emotions at the emotional level. Not everybody has the tools they need to be able to work through difficult emotions, to be able to be resilient, to not burn out. So it's
Mhm.
that psychologically. And then spiritually, people don't know what to believe. People could be
Yeah.
mad at God.
Mhm.
People could feel very empty inside. And I think
Yeah.
those biologically, psychologically, socially, and spiritually are all the reasons for,
Mhm.
you know,
Uh,
what we're
I,
describing.
I just love that response. I mean, you really broke that down. It seems like the biological component, maybe the more difficult one to deal with, but surely social, cultural things that we can work on. I want to move now into an area where people live, the mental health kind of challenges that people face. Are you okay with that?
Absolutely.
And I want to start with, I announced that I would be having you on the show. And one of our followers asked that if I would put a question to you. So let me just tell you a little bit about him. When he was 16 years old, his stepfather shot him, intending to kill him, but instead damaged his optic nerve and left him blind. He's now 56 years old. Now, he didn't stop with the trauma of all of that. He could have been bitter for a long time and forever, but he graduated college, earned a master's degree, married, and now a functioning human being. He said that he found his faith, Christianity, useful in resolving the bitterness, that could have developed about his stepfather, and the anger, from what he did to him. Here's his question. How do you see, Dr. Yu, um, how do you see your work benefiting people like him who, might have been shot, left for dead, or those living with chronic pain or mental health problems? He said he saw spirituality. He said, the question is, how can spirituality help these people not only cope with their adversity, but also overcome them? So that's what he wanted me to put to you. Hope that you see a question there, and I hope that you'll have a response for him.
It's an amazing question. And I want to commend him on how much he's overcome and his strength and capacity and resilience because, just as the question points out, not everybody has that capacity of strength and resilience to overcome something like this. And, no matter who you are, you have had trauma, whether that's trauma with a big T, like this man, and trauma with a big T means trauma where there is a possibility of the loss of life or limb. Certainly having someone shoot you is one such trauma. My goodness, it just like breaks my heart to even be talking about this. And then the other of us, the rest of us who have not necessarily had trauma with a capital T, have trauma with a lowercase t. And those are the things that have kept us up at night and led us to cry for days on end. And that could have been loss of loved ones or important breakups or failures of one sort or another, or health issues or something happening to our children or whatever that is, right? It's trauma with a lowercase t. And there's a lot of us who, when these things happen, we can feel like victims. We can feel like victims and then get trapped in our victimhood. We can blame others. We can blame the perpetrator. And then it's very easy to actually spend your whole life as a victim burning and blaming the perpetrator. And it's a very sad place to be because the mentality of a victim is that you're stuck, that it's somebody else has control or has had control over your life. And so it's so important for individuals like this brave man who asked this question, as he has done, to relinquish victim mentality and to the best of our ability to forgive. Not to forgive somebody to say that it was okay to do that, because it obviously was not under any circumstances, but to forgive in the sense that you don't want this person living in your heart and mind anymore rent-free, taking up space and affecting your life. So forgiveness is never about the person being forgiven. They might not even know. They don't have to know. It's about you, and it's about you freeing yourself to live the life you want, like this man has started to do.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I'm sure he's going to listen to this show and get the response directly from you. But I also appreciate you for telling us about, because I've heard about big T trauma before and little T trauma before, but I think this is the first time I've heard someone actually, explain the difference between these two. So I want to spend a little time talking about trauma for a moment. Firstly, what is trauma? How would you define it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Trauma is something that shakes you up and that often could lead you to question your sense of self, your sense of identity, and psychologically, trauma is defined as anything where there is a threat to your life or limb. That's,
Mhm.
and that could be a whole bunch of things, very traumatic. And now, when you think about it at a more psychological level, the things that are most traumatic, it might not be what you think. Certainly getting shot, that qualifies like at the top of the list. But a breakup for somebody, the first breakup for somebody who this is the person who I've loved and who loves me and who affirmed who I am like nobody else ever has before. And suddenly they're making the choice to no longer love me. That for people is trauma, and that's attachment trauma. So for the majority of us with little t trauma, it's attachment trauma. It's trauma in the context of relationships where things didn't go quite as planned. And so that's sort of a more colloquial definition of trauma.
I love it. Yeah. So is trauma, is the experience of trauma inherent in life? The reason why I ask this is that, you know, God is responsible for some traumatic experiences. The death of a child, for example, and the list goes on. It seems that trauma is inherent in just life. And the reason why I put it that way is that, you know, let's face it. I mean, a family could have a child that may die early. That's a traumatic experience. So is trauma something that we must or should, hate to use the word should, but is trauma something that just happens in ordinary life?
Yeah, if we're talking about trauma, either with a capital or lowercase t, yes, trauma is something that's a part of life. Stress, adversity, traumatic experiences that are painful are a part of life, and we can expect them. And for many people, those traumas are endings because the truth about life is that everything ends, including every relationship we'll ever have and our own life, right? And so, with that being said, those endings are deep losses. And we as human beings are very attached to people we love. We talked about Buddhism and about non-attachment, but we live in the Western world where attachment is the mainstream of Western culture and how we see the world and how we really, it's the currency of exchange is attachment. Our sense of life and purpose in life is often from the people that we are closest to. And so
Mhm.
when those relationships end, when somebody gets sick, when we get sick, that's traumatic. And
Yeah.
that's just a part of life for better or for worse.
Uh-huh. When I first heard of trauma, especially PTSD, post-traumatic stress, was in connection with the Vietnam War. Thought that trauma was something that happened on the battlefield. But you're suggesting more than that, aren't you? That it's not just about soldiers returning from war.
Absolutely. And so let's also define it. So when we're talking about trauma with a capital T, no, not everybody will experience that. And thank God for that.
Mm.
And there are people who experience trauma with a capital T and experience a lot of that as children. There's even a scale of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and they have numerous things on that list. And the more of those you have, the more ACEs you have, then the more likely you are to have anxiety, depression, have trouble with relationships, have trouble getting a job, wind up on the streets homeless, have drug addiction problems, have domestic violence issues. So those things, traumas for young children at an early age, basically create a foundation of difficulty for those young people. And so this is being recognized now, and a lot is being done to find these people and to help them to give them the strength to move beyond their upbringing.
I'm so glad that people like you are talking about trauma and writing about trauma and educating about this, especially childhood trauma. But looking at childhood trauma in particular, what kinds of things might be traumatic for a child? And I know it differs from person to person, but what kinds of things would you put on that list?
Definitely. So let's talk about what some of the adverse childhood experiences are in that scale, right? Childhood sexual abuse, not having food in the family, having parents who were abusive physically with each other or with the child that the child witnessed, not having a home, not having access to clean water, being in an environment where there is gunshots or constant violence, or being in a home where there is violence, whether domestic violence, being, in a place where there is a lot of addiction, or being born to a drug addicted parent. So those are just a few of the things. And those are
Hmm.
very, very severe things. And there's many things that are often as traumatic, but a little bit lower down on the list.
Right. Oh gosh. And we know about these things now, but before 1960, I don't believe anyone talked about this kind of stuff. And most of us were probably in homes where trauma existed. So is it possible for a child who experienced those things to grow out of them or to heal from them?
Yeah. And children do. I mean, I just actually saw that they said that Simone Biles was adopted by her grandfather at the age of 6, prior to which she was in foster care because she was born to a drug addicted mother, and she and her sister were removed at the age of 3. I'd not seen this information before. I saw this today. And so here is somebody who is the most decorated gymnast in the world, right? And so absolutely people can move beyond that. Absolutely. I believe, and sometimes it's very difficult, but absolutely.
Sure. Where there's one, there's hope for others. I love that example. Here is another area of trauma that people talk about it. I'm not satisfied with the way we talk about it, and that is racial trauma. Have you looked at that in any way? And can you
Absolutely.
share some things about that for us?
Yeah, that is incredibly traumatic as well, because there are aspects of systemic racism that are part of our culture and the way that people see the world. And it's embedded not just in the individuals who are affected by the racism, but often the very people who the racism could be denoted against also have the same perceptions, and so what I mean is that there is uh, a lot of data showing that outcomes for certain minority populations within healthcare are worse, like with obstetrics and gynecology, with cancer, et cetera. And now that this is known about, we're taking steps to change that. But the truth is that even among members of the minority group, they still will provide care that is lesser to minorities than to non-minorities, unless
Hmm.
they're really made aware of this data. And people hate seeing this. They're like, how can this possibly be that this is so entrenched? And but this is aspects of systemic racism that are so present within our culture. And this is just one example. And then to be on the receiving end and to be in a race or ethnic group, and this is not just racial, but it's also for individuals, for instance, who are questioning or transgender or any other group that is not the minority dominant population, and where there's a lot of discrimination. Those groups have greater depression. They have worse outcomes for physical as well as mental well-being. And it's super important to be aware of that and to
Mhm.
do everything that we can to raise even greater awareness and put practices in place so that we can have more equitable, high quality mental and physical health care.
Yeah. It seems to me that it's easier to talk about trauma globally, or even to talk about childhood trauma, or the trauma of, and I could be wrong here, but I've heard Dr. Gabor Mate, for example, talked about the trauma associated with himself as a child, in a Jewish family. But when it comes to racial trauma, it seems to be a more difficult subject for people to engage. I could be wrong there, but what's your sense of that? And why do you suppose that may be the case?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that on some level, people could not fully understand if they haven't been going through it. So Dr. Gabor Mate probably was sharing the part of discrimination that he himself, as a Jew, a minority, a religious minority, was able to experience. And I also am a Jewish minority, but I can't say that I've experienced religious persecution by virtue of that. And I know right now what's happening in our world is so, so difficult. This we've never, ever had before. And I feel like, I'm understanding in a way I never had what probably so many disadvantaged groups have had to deal with. But I think that
Mhm.
that's really the reason, because most people can't really, it's hard to empathize fully with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a subject, I think, especially racial trauma, that we have never fully engaged. So when you look at the United States in particular, before 1950, we didn't have a sense of what that meant coming out of first slavery, then coming out of segregation, then coming out of, all of the other things that followed. So anyway, I'm glad that you were able to give us some insights into that. Stress and health. What can you tell us about that? The connection between stress, especially a person who may have experienced, let's call it distress, where the water is, pouring out of the a bucket. Stress and health. What can you tell us?
Absolutely. We were talking about trauma, and when you think about stress and trauma, they're essentially on a continuum. A little bit of stress is stress. A lot of stress is trauma. That's another way you can think about that, right? And all of us are
Yeah.
going to experience stress, and stress can be positive or negative. Eustress is the positive stress. Distress is the negative stress. Eustress is you have a promotion. You then have to now move to a different company, a new office, new responsibilities. That's stressful, but it's really positive. You're going to get married. Guess what? Getting married is really stressful, but it's also really positive and exciting. You're about to have a new baby. That's also stressful, but that's also exciting. That's my dog over there decided to be a part of the podcast.
Yeah, I'm glad that he's there.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally. So that's the eustress. Now, distress is when things happen and you're like, I'd rather this not be happening. And this is also a part of life, like we talked about, like the trauma with lowercase t. And when you are stressed, you have two things in the body that happen. You have two systems that are working almost in opposition. The sympathetic system, which is the fight or flight system, that's the system that responds to stress. And then you have the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest system. Too much stress, you have too much fight or flight. And that leads to all kinds of issues in your brain and in your body. And when I was an undergrad, I worked in Dr. Robert Sapolsky's lab at Stanford, studying the effects of stress on the brain. And what we found was that the part of the brain most affected by stress was your hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the part responsible for learning and memory. So if you are stressed, your learning and memory will be affected.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, stress is something that our culture need to pay more and more attention to for sure. A little bit is good, but like anything, too much is bad for you.
Exactly.
And yeah, anxiety. What is it? What is anxiety? What
Yeah,
is that? Mm.
absolutely. So anxiety is also an offshoot of stress. They're also on a continuum. And anxiety has a psychiatric sort of definition. It's a diagnosis. There's many forms of anxiety. Anxiety disorders come in, various flavors. Obsessive compulsive disorder is an anxiety disorder. Generalized anxiety disorder. Phobias are anxiety disorders. Social anxiety. So all of this falls under, anxiety. But what anxiety is generally, it's more this existential distress about life. It's the fact that life is stressful and it's not uncommon or unusual. It's completely legitimate, actually, to respond to life in a way that could be stressful at times. And what we want to learn over time is how to be more accepting of ourselves, our response, and of life so that life over time becomes less stressful and we're able to be more in flow with what comes, no matter what it is.
Mhm. Yeah, and understanding is so important. There's a little bit of anxiety may be a good thing, but too much of
Mhm.
anything, as we've already said. Here's the big one that, people, I guess more and more today we talk about it, and that is the D word, depression. Depression. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, depression. Depression is a very sad state, and it's a state that you don't want to be in for a long period of time. And it's unfortunately something that very many people deal with. The lifetime
Mhm.
prevalence of depression is about between 20 and 25%. So, and depression is defined also a psychiatric diagnosis, but it could present in many different ways. So, for some people, depression is they can't get out of bed. They're sleeping all the time. They have no energy. They're not hungry. They just want to sleep. One form of depression. For other people, they're sleeping just fine. They have plenty of energy. It's their mind that's not working. They're having ruminative thoughts all the time. They can't stop thinking. They're like mired with guilt or shame, feeling like they've done something wrong. They're constantly sad. It's another form of depression. And another
Yeah.
form of depression is Somebody is eating their emotion. They keep eating. They're doing everything. They're like really sped up and anxious. Like there's an anxious depression. It's having too much energy rather than not enough energy. So depression
Mhm.
can come in many flavors, but the most important thing is if you have it, it's treatable. And there's many ways
Yeah.
to treat depression through
Yeah.
therapy, through exercise. Exercise is very powerful to treat depression. Regular
Yeah.
exercise, 30 minutes a day, 5 days a
Mhm.
week. That's a powerful treatment for depression. There's powerful
Yeah.
medications as well, and many, many other things.
Yeah, and we want to get into paths to healing in a moment. I'm glad you mentioned those. But before we do that, I want to go back to childhood trauma and want to ask you, it's because some young parents aren't aware of what could be traumatic to a child. I mean, in some cases, you got, teenagers trying to be parents. So is shouting at a child, yelling at a child, could that be traumatic, or is that just a natural part of adult-child relationship?
You know, raising one's voice at a child, sometimes that's done in order to reinforce a point. And people sometimes will lose it. That's also human. As best
Mm,
as possible for people to be able to have patience with their child and patience with themselves, and to be
mm,
able to set boundaries without necessarily raising their voice, which could be hard, especially if the child has attention deficit disorder, if the child has impulse control issues, if the child has oppositional defiant disorder.
mm,
Sometimes you need firmer boundaries, and that firmer boundary could be raising one's voice. But to the
mhm.
degree possible, if people are able to find ways of connecting with their child that doesn't involve any form of violence, that doesn't involve hitting, that doesn't involve yelling, that doesn't involve anything like that, all the better.
I love the way you answer that question because, to tell you the truth, I assumed that you would throw the parent under the bus, but you didn't do that. I heard compassion. I mean, it's best not to do that, but you understood that in certain circumstances, a human being may lose it, hopefully just once. I love that response. I didn't expect that. So thank you for that. I really benefited from that. Wow. So I'm blown away with that one. Okay, so let's go to paths to healing now. You've already mentioned some things. If a person, does discover that, he or she is experiencing depression, going to their doctor, they get a social health screening, and the doctor, oh, you come back with signs of depression. You're saying there are some things we can do about that.
Yeah, there's so many things we can do. So if you have
Mm,
depression, there's a bunch of things. First and foremost, there's medication. There's powerful medications that
mm,
work really well for depression. And for
mm,
some people, taking a pill a day is really the easiest thing. It's the easiest solution. These pills don't work for everybody, but they do work for a significant portion of the population with relatively minimal side effects. And these pills are like an antidepressant medication like
mm,
Zoloft or Prozac or Lexapro, something like that,
mm,
powerful medications. That's one solution. Therapy is another solution.
mm,
And there's many different kinds of therapies. There is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is more focused on your thoughts and focused on thoughts that you might have that are leading you to make bad choices or to
mm.
not see the world in the most positive light or not see your situation in an accurate light, or you might be catastrophizing and to recognize the content of those thoughts. So that's one form of therapy, but there's many forms of therapy. And
Mhm.
then there's also, for a lot of people, their distress is existential. Something needs to shift in their life. They could be feeling lonely or alone. So community can be a very positive treatment for depression. Eating
Mhm.
healthy, getting good exercise, taking good care of oneself, getting ample rest. Those are also very powerful treatments for depression that we often overlook. We're so focused on the mind treatments, which is medication and therapy, that we sometimes forget the body and the spirit. And the body and the
Yeah.
spirit is as involved in depression treatment and actually treatment for any mental health issue as is the mind and the brain.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, there's a lot there. But you mentioned community, and the person who is experiencing depression needs community, but may have difficulties getting into a community. So this is a message, I think, to friends and families to be aware, and to perhaps be supportive of someone who they acknowledge may be struggling. I think I either read something that you wrote or heard you say, and this really, you really flipped the switch for me on this one. You said something to the effect that religion, that is attending church, mosque, and whatever you want to say, spiritual community, can play a positive role in fostering health. Can you
Mhm.
say a little more about that for me?
Yeah, there's actually so much, Dr. Stephen, about precisely that. There's so much science now supporting that. For
Mhm.
instance, there's a professor at Harvard, Tyler Vanderweel, who studies suicide. And he's shown with hundreds of thousands of patients that if you go to church weekly, your risk of committing suicide goes down by 5 times. This is a humongous decrease. And this is over like decades. It's a very real effect. And so we're like, what is it that causes that? Is it the community? Is it the positive beliefs about life that are espoused in church? Is it having that structure? And the most powerful thing is actually none of those. It's the moral prohibition against suicide that going to
Oh,
church ensues. But all the
oh,
other things contribute as well. So that's just one thing. But separate from this really powerful data, because when we're thinking about mental health, right, the failure of our mental health system is suicide, which is why the study with Tyler Vanderbilt is so important. So
mhm,
spirituality and spiritual commitment directly affects people's choices like this.
mhm.
Then separate from that, there's tons of data showing that spiritual beliefs and practices, and this is both religious, going to church or synagogue or mosque, or secular, like meditation or yoga or being part of a new age spiritual community, that actually improves your well-being, your mental health, and your physical health. And this has been shown
Yeah.
across many mental health and physical conditions from cancer to heart disease.
hmm Well, I'll tell you what, as I said, you really, when I heard that and I heard it from you, it really flipped the switch for me because heck, I'm one of these people who have been back in the day turned off by religion. And you say, look, there's a positive thing that religion does in our culture. So that was quite helpful. How
Mm.
about this one? And I've heard more and more people talk about the role of psychedelics in helping them regain balance, emotional balance. What do you think about psychedelics like MDMA or whatever to help a person
Mm.
overcome some trauma or and regain emotional balance?
Yeah. I think that there's increasing research and data showing how powerful certain psychedelics can be in helping people overcome, as you said, trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder or numerous other mental health conditions from addiction to depression to anxiety. So the legal psychedelic right now in our country is ketamine. And so even though it's only FDA approved for treatment-resistant depression, it's actually used off-label for numerous other conditions, including alcohol addiction, including anxiety for some people, including a number of other things as well, including trauma. And then there's psilocybin, which is mushrooms. And there's a lot of data showing that it also is helpful for numerous mental health conditions. It's not legal, it's decriminalized in certain states, and it's legal outside of the United States in certain countries like the Netherlands and
Mhm,
Jamaica, but it's not yet federally legal. And it is decriminalized in a few states. So there are ways
mhm,
that you can get this either as microdosing, so taking small doses without having any perceptual changes, or actually as having the psychedelic. So actually shift, like it actually shifting your perception a little bit.
mhm.
And then you
Well,
mentioned specifically, yeah,
no, please.
yeah. You mentioned specifically MDMA or ecstasy. And so Rick Doblin has been pioneering this effort to get this FDA approved. And we're going to know relatively soon whether it was approved or not. We don't have the final verdict. It looked like it wasn't going to be approved this time around from um, what recently transpired. But basically, the data is good, but it's the safety and efficacy, it's the safety profile that because the state that's created in a person who undergoes this treatment, it's a very vulnerable state. So, and it's a question of how do you keep that person safe in
Yeah.
such a vulnerable state? And we don't yet have excellent answers to that.
Mhm,
Um, yeah, but I very much hope that Rick's work will be successful because there are so many people with trauma, especially our veterans, for whom nothing has worked. And then in these trials, some of this has worked, or psychedelics have worked, or they've gone to do ayahuasca and that's worked. This is another, ayahuasca is another psychedelic, not legal in our country, but legal in outside of the United States, especially in South American cultures, and often administered by a shaman that also has some medical efficacy and scientific efficacy for certain conditions. So I hope that it's going to start to be more a part of our mainstream medical care over time as well.
Yeah, you're reporting good news to me because, 50 years ago, when a person struggled, sometimes they often struggle alone. But what you've just reported, there are a number of things that we can do, and more things that seemingly are coming out daily, including psychedelics. I want to extend this discussion, if you're up to it, to talk about just a moment about the Supreme, about God. Because some people would probably say, hey, is God absent? What's going on here with all of the stuff that is going on? So my first question to you about this is there, what is free will? That is, are we free agents and we get to do what we choose, or are we set up because there's no free will?
Well, Dr. Robert Sapolsky, in whose lab I worked at Stanford, just came out with a book called Determined, where he argues that there's no free will and that all of us are a constellation of numerous factors, biological, psychological, social, cultural, all the way down to our most small intercellular biological level. And he believes that there's, by virtue of how you came into this world, it determines who you're going to become. And maybe the free will you have in life is relegated to whether you're going to brush your teeth like this or like this. That's your free will. And the rest of it, you pretty much, it's pretty much determined. I think that that's he's absolutely brilliant and I like his argument. And I think that for us as humans, it's important to believe that we have at least some free will and that our choices do matter. Like we know ultimately that for addiction, for instance, willpower is an important part of the equation, but willpower is not enough. So you need to have all sorts of safety nets in place because sometimes with your free will, you might make the wrong choice, and relapse is a part of recovery. And so overcoming addiction isn't just about using your free will. It's having a system in place for when your free will fails you. But I think it's most important for us as humans to live as if we have free will, whether that's the truth or not, because it's a more empowering way of living.
Yeah, I love that. I like that a lot. Live as though you have it and make the best choices you think you can make. So, in terms of you as an entity, is there, what is you? Are you the self, or is there a bigger self that's a part of you as you are? What is the
You're
self?
asking the
Is it
big question.
individualized?
Yeah, you're asking the big questions, Dr. Stephen, and there's many, I wish that I could answer this question scientifically, but I can answer it more philosophically as to what the different beliefs are, right? There's some people, it reminds me of, I, during my residency, I traveled the world trying to understand this concept of soul. What is the soul? And my favorite answer to that question was from a Mexican shaman named Fernando Broca, who said that the soul is composed of two parts. One is that which connects us to everybody and everything. So when they say that we are one unified soul, that's what they mean. My soul is connected to you, your soul, and is connected to every other soul in the world. And then there's a part of our soul that is individual, made up of your own unique experiences, expertise, purpose, loves, whatever is unique to you. And so I think this is who we are as the self, the two parts of soul, the part that is interconnected with everybody and everything, and the part that is unique. And that unique part of you, there's multiple selves. There's a higher self and a lower self. We all know that for many decisions, there is a better choice we can make and a lesser choice we can make. We can give into temptation, we can overcome temptation. Aligning with that higher self is what we want to do as much as we can. And then it's also recognizing that sometimes humans will, like we talked about, snap at a child or make a bad decision or give into temptation, recognizing that that too is human and that you learn from that and next time make a different decision.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Well, I got to ask you one more question. you wrote this book. I just love the primary title, Fulfilled. How did that title come to you, by the way? Was it something that just dropped into you, or were you doodling around until you came to it?
No, it just came, as for whenever I do things like that, whenever about big things in my life, it just kind of comes. We all have different ways of receiving intuitive information. And there's
Mm,
actually a few different ways, right? Clairvoyance, we can see it. Clairaudience, we can hear it. We can hear like the word fulfilled. Clairsentience, we can feel it in our body or feel it
mm,
emotionally. Or claircognizance, it'll come as a thought or you'll just know it. So for me,
mm.
my number one intuitive capacity is my claircognizance. And so everything comes as a thought. So this is how this came as well. Oh, fulfilled. That needs to be the title of my book.
Yeah, I tell you, sometimes titles are rehashed. I don't think anyone has ever written a book with the primary title Fulfilled. And it seems to me that there's a promise there, Doc. Is it possible for a person, though, to discover a life of fulfillment?
I think it's what we're all seeking. And also fulfillment, it depends on the definition, right? If
Uh-huh.
what fulfillment means to you is being constantly happy and feeling constant joy, that's hard because life also has trauma with a capital or lowercase t and stress and difficulty and adversity.
Mhm.
But if fulfillment means savoring the moments of joy when we have them, doing our
Mhm.
best to be a really good person and find meaning in the struggles and in the adversity, then yes,
Mhm.
you could live a consistently fulfilled life.
Uh-huh. I love it. So, in a nutshell, advertisement for this book. What do you do in this book that's going to help me, speaking for myself now, live a
Mhm.
more fulfilled life?
Absolutely. So I take you through three primary tenets of fulfillment. The book is divided into three sections. The first one is authenticity. So, who are you separate from all the other voices in society? Your parents, your family, your wife, your children. Who are you separate from that? To really put you in touch with your soul and align with your soul in the most authentic way. That's the first four chapters. The second part is about this concept of soul correction. And that's what your
Mm,
soul has come into this world to correct. And you can learn about your soul correction by asking the question, what are the most painful, challenging, and difficult parts of my life? And you look at that, it's like what Sigmund Freud referred to as repetition compulsions. It's those things that come into your life again and again and again, often much to your chagrin and dismay, and despite your best efforts to change it. So, part two of the book is about soul corrections and describes four different soul corrections that human beings have. And then part three is a connection to a part of something greater than oneself. And this is where a lot of spiritual concepts like consciousness, synchronicity, immortality, and interconnectedness are described in detail. And throughout the
mm,
book, there's many case examples and many exercises to take you deep into those spaces and actually enable you to do the transformational work on your own.
mhm. Well, I tell you, seems like a powerful book to me, and I'm so glad that you wrote it. So, look, is there anything else that you want to share that I haven't asked you today?
Oh, thank you so much, Stephen. So I'll just share that we have a live transformational workshop. It's a day-long transformational workshop that I'm doing with two of my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Eva Selhub and nurse Sana Fuller. It's in a beautiful waterfront home in Darien, Connecticut on Saturday, November 2nd. And so if you're interested, you can go to my website, www.annayusim.com, and you'll see a pop-up with information about it, or you could email me, and we would love to have you join us.
Fantastic. That's an opportunity if you're listening to go to this workshop. Well, look, I enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you so much for saying yes when I invited you to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen. It's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for inviting me.
Okay. Well, you have been listening to the Possibility Action Network podcast. Our guest today has been Dr. Anna Yusim, the author of this book called Fulfilled. I'm your host, Stephen Middleton. Until next time, good day.
You are not alone. Just keep on, keep on, keep on going. Just press on, press on.